It was a Friday evening in Melbourne, Australia, in December 2010. The temperature hovered around 25 degrees Celsius, and the city was buzzing with the sounds of weekend plans, clinking glasses, and the casual footsteps of people strolling into cafes and pubs. Among the many buildings in the inner-city suburb of St Kilda, the Balenciaga apartments towered over the street, 18 stories of modern glass and metal overlooking the bay. In apartment 1201, 24-year-old Phoebe Handsjuk was alone. Her boyfriend, Anthony Hampel, a prominent events promoter with deep connections in Melbourne's elite circles, was away at work. According to the building's security logs and his later statement, he had left that morning and returned in the early evening. What he returned to was something no one could have predicted. The apartment door was closed, the lights were on. Anthony claimed that when he entered the home, he saw broken glass on the floor and the apartment's pet cat acting strangely. But Phoebe wasn't there. Her phone and keys were. Downstairs, a concierge had heard a loud crash earlier that day but hadn't investigated immediately. It wasn't until much later, when maintenance workers entered the ground floor garbage room, that the true horror was discovered. Phoebe's lifeless body was found in a pool of blood, limbs contorted in unnatural positions beside an overturned metal garbage bin. She had fallen feet first down the garbage chute from the 12th floor. The fall alone would have been fatal for most people, but it wasn't just the fall. Her jeans were partially around her ankles, her hands bore cuts and bruises, and her face was severely injured. The bin she landed in had been split by the force of the impact. At first glance, the scene looked like a horrific accident or suicide. But the details told a different story. Who was Phoebe Handsjuk? Phoebe was not your average young woman. She was creative, introspective, and deeply emotional, a talented artist, a free spirit who had struggled with depression and alcohol misuse, but also someone fiercely loved by her friends and family. Her relationship with Anthony Hampel had been intense. He was older, established, and connected. She was younger, impulsive, and at times volatile. Friends described their relationship as passionate but unstable. Phoebe had reportedly tried to leave him several times, even emailing herself a draft goodbye letter weeks before her death. There were reports of past incidents, one involving Phoebe smashing a mirror in a moment of distress. Another time, she was said to have overdosed on sleeping pills and called for help. Her grandfather was a retired judge, her father a psychiatrist, her mother a school teacher, all deeply concerned about Phoebe's well-being. But despite everything, no one expected her to die like this. The idea that Phoebe climbed into the garbage chute and slid down willingly was almost impossible to imagine. The entrance to the chute was about 90 centimeters off the ground and only 37 centimeters wide. Investigators had to test whether it was even physically possible for someone to enter it voluntarily. To their surprise, it was possible, but extremely difficult. It required someone to climb onto a ledge, lift the heavy hatch, contort their body, and force themselves down into darkness. Police ruled it a tragic accident, an open and shut case. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses, no struggle, no note. But the Handsjuk family didn't accept the conclusion. They hired their own forensic experts and began to investigate. What they uncovered was chilling. The first thing the independent team did was slow the story down. Police had moved quickly, drawing a line from intoxication to misadventure, as if the path were straight and obvious. The private pathologist, a calm woman with the steady hands of someone who'd seen too much, insisted there was no straight line here, only bends, gaps, and questions. She asked for the raw photographs, not just the report summaries, the lift logs, not just the concierge statements, the original toxicology, not just the conclusion paragraph. She wanted the apartment, the hallway, the garbage room, the chute opening on level 12, the exact handle, the weight of the hatch, the distance to the floor. She wanted to know what it would feel like to touch the place where Phoebe's last fingerprints might have been. They measured the mouth of the chute, high off the floor, small in width, a heavy steel door that resisted a lazy pull. They timed how long it took a sober, athletic adult to open it, to get a knee up, to tuck a shoulder, to commit to the darkness beyond. They tried it in denim, in socks, with a phone in hand, with a simulated blood alcohol level, controlled, safe, clinical. Even with cooperation and coaching, it was graceless and clumsy, a choreography of effort and awareness. One tester slipped, another bruised a shin. It was a task you prepared for. It was not the sort of thing you stumbled into while foggy and unsteady. Then they drove out to the lab to look again at what had been inside. Phoebe's blood. The official report noted alcohol at a level the papers would later fixate on, and the presence of a sedative, Stilnox, known to play tricks with balance and memory. The family's toxicologist didn't argue the numbers. He argued the meaning. High alcohol doesn't explain the choices someone supposedly made when they were already struggling to stand. A sedative doesn't motivate the opening of a heavy chute, the deliberate alignment of the body feet first, the final push into a narrow shaft. He circled the word voluntary 3 times in the coroner's findings and wrote in the margin, "Voluntary requires planning." Back in the apartment, the experts followed the map of Phoebe's last known movements in smudges and fragments. There were small patterns of broken glass on the kitchen floor that hadn't been properly discussed. They noticed the cat's water bowl disturbed, a faint track of droplets toward the hallway. They saw a smear on the lower edge of the laundry door at a height that suggested a hand while crouching, not falling. They took note of the phone left behind, the keys where they shouldn't be if she were heading out, the laptop sleeping, lid down as if interrupted mid-thought. They were not smoking guns, any of them, but together they kept whispering the same thing. This story is missing steps. The concierge remembered a noise earlier in the day, a sound like a tremendous metal strike and then a crash, but didn't connect it at the time to anything human. Downstairs, the garbage room told a different truth. The metal bin had split from force, its seam opening like a wound. The floor recorded violence the way floors do, scuffs, dark staining, small pebbled impressions where weight had hit and shifted. And then there were the objects, her jeans half down, her hands marked with shallow cuts, and bruises, a face injured in a way that didn't match cleanly with the smooth interior of the chute. People talk about the blunt arithmetic of physics, as if math will save you from doubt. But here it didn't resolve the question, it magnified it. The family pushed for video. What did the cameras see? The building was modern, secure, proud of its systems. There was footage of the lobby, of the lifts opening and closing, of the front door, of nobody who mattered. Nothing showed the impossible. A young woman carrying herself toward an act that would end everything. There were lift logs that proved traffic on level 12, but doors can open without intent, people can pass without glancing up, and silence is not evidence of peace. Friends described the weeks before as tight with tension. Phoebe had a restless energy, the kind that writes and deletes the same message 3 times. She wanted to leave and then didn't. She said things were going to change, and then they did not. She could be impulsive, she could be luminous, she could be unwell. She had drunk too much sometimes. She had reached for sleep in a pill bottle sometimes. She had loved hard and fought hard, and then apologized with a softness that made people forgive her more than they should have. None of that explained a chute. One of the family's experts insisted on testing the hypothesis that she was conscious when she entered the mouth of the shaft. "Find me marks," he said, "find me proof of grip." He dusted, he swabbed, he studied the hinge. There should have been fingertip traces on the inside lip if she'd braced, if she'd adjusted herself to go feet first. There should have been more of her on that steel, and not only in the ambiguous transfer on the outside edge. Maybe time had eaten it. Maybe cleaning had done what cleaning does. Maybe the story was never going to admit what happened there. When the inquest finally came, slow, procedural, public, the room filled with the cruelty of formality. Phrases like, "on the balance of probabilities," did battle with the raw animal insistence of grief. The coroner listened to experts who swore that alcohol and Stilnox could produce sleepwalking, automatism, acts performed without full awareness. He listened to those who warned that the chute itself demanded purpose, that a body could slip in only after decisions had been made. He weighed it all and then wrote what would never feel like enough. The precise manner of entry could not be determined, and there was no clear evidence of third-party involvement. Officially, it was not homicide. Officially, it was not suicide. Officially, it was the kind of death that polite systems label so they can file it away. But official language rarely quiets a family's questions. Her mother kept speaking to anyone who would listen. Her father kept turning pages in reports that refused to become coherent. Her grandfather, a man who had once measured the world in statutes and precedent, found himself at the mercy of doubt. They were not conspiracy theorists, they said. They were asking for a standard of curiosity equal to the strangeness of the facts. The relationship at the center of her home was examined like an artifact. People who had seen the couple together described intensity, tenderness, the flaring of tempers, the smoothing over, the cycle you see too often when two people carry their storms inside one small space. There were stories of wanting to leave, of staying, of drafting goodbyes that were never sent. None of it convicted anyone of anything. All of it refused to let the simple story stand. Journalists began to arrive. They took the stairs, they took the lift, they stood in the corridor at level 12 and measured their own shoulders against the mouth of the chute. On the radio, late at night, callers offered their theories with the rough edges of grief for someone they didn't know. On the internet, people diagrammed the geometry of a fall, the timing of a lift stopping at a floor, the distance between an apartment door and a decision. A documentary team reconstructed the garbage room with terrifying fidelity. The first time they let a dummy drop feet first through a replica shaft, the camera operator couldn't help the sound he made when metal screamed below. The independent pathologist wrote something in her final memo that stayed with everyone who read it. "When we call a death accidental," she wrote, "we do not absolve ourselves of the need to understand the behavior that preceded it." She argued that intoxication and sedation described state, not motive. She pointed out that Phoebe's injuries included patterns not entirely explained by a smooth tube and a single terminal impact. She said the scene upstairs, the little facts, the interrupted paths, felt less like a night of sleepwalking and more like a day that had gone wrong in ways that words weren't quite allowed to name. Time passed, which is what time does to the living. The apartment changed occupants. The concierge learned to answer the same few questions the same polite way when reporters called. The family built a ritual around the date no one could bear. A petition circulated, arguing for design changes to chutes in residential buildings, for alarms, for interlocks, for anything that might prevent another body from finding a shaft that only garbage should know. The city listened in the way cities do. Some landlords changed fixtures, some promised audits. Most waited for attention to move on. It didn't, not completely. Every so often the story came back, a tide that remembered the shore. A new article would quote a friend not heard from before, a neighbor who remembered a sound differently now, an expert with a different measurement, a court filing that was not evidence but suggested that people who could have said more still preferred not to. The boyfriend built a quieter public life. He didn't owe anyone an explanation, the law said. The law was right about that. The heart does not care. In the late hours of a winter evening, the private investigator sat with the pathologist and a detective friend in a small office lined with boxes. They had, at last, the original lift event logs from the day Phoebe died, the ones with timestamps down to the second. They trace the movement of metal boxes up and down shafts, the opening of doors on level 12 and level 1 and level 18, the weirdly human pattern of how a building breathes. Something in the sequence made them go still. A lift had opened on 12 at a time that didn't match any resident swipe. A service key could do that, or a hand that already knew the building in ways a resident might not. It was not enough to accuse. It was enough to wake an old question. If a stranger had walked those halls that afternoon, who knew and why did no camera offer even a shadow? The final minutes, everyone agreed, were the saddest because they were the most imagined. A hallway empty, a door that may have closed too quickly, a phone left on a bench that still glowed with a lock screen no one would ever unlock again, a cat pacing, ears pricked for a sound the human memory could not hold, a person, maybe the same, maybe another, standing in front of a steel mouth and making the one decision that the rest of us would spend years trying to understand. In the last lines of the family's public statement, the words were simple and terrible. We do not accept that an explanation is impossible. We do not accept that our daughter, our granddaughter, slipped through a gap in curiosity wide enough to swallow a life. We ask again, and we will continue to ask. And because this is a story about a death that refuses to settle, it should end the way it lived, with questions that are not rhetorical, with a grief that has learned to stand up straight. Did Phoebe open that hatch herself in a moment of disordered will that even she could not have named? Did someone help her toward it by neglect, by pressure, by the blunt weight of a dynamic that left her cornered? Did a third party move in the quiet spaces of a building and vanish down a stairwell while the rest of the city made dinner and laughed and sent messages they would never think to save? If you came here for a verdict, the city already gave you one. If you came here for truth, you will have to live with the kind that comes in pieces. The lift logs, the hinge weight, the bruise that won't map cleanly to a curve of steel, the timing that never quite agrees with the story it's asked to serve. The certainty that the person we lost was a whole life, not a case study. The certainty that attention is a kind of justice when justice will not come. There is a way to close a story like this that feels cruelly tidy, to fold it into a lesson about design standards and crisis lines and the pharmacology of sleep. Those are important. They are not what her family wanted you to remember. They wanted you to see the shape of a young woman's days before the headlines, the way she spoke, when she was funny, the way she could draw you into a plan and make you believe it would happen the way she loved her people, even when it was messy. They wanted, in the end, not to win an argument, but to keep her from being reduced to a mechanism, a chute, a fall, a bin, a line in a report. So this is what's left. And maybe it is not nothing. To keep saying her name, to keep asking better questions than the ones we started with, to refuse to call closure what is only exhaustion. Somewhere, on some evening when the city air is the same warm temperature it was that day, someone will hear a dull metallic sound and look up and remember her. Somewhere, a designer will add a sensor to a door because he read her story and could not shake it. Somewhere, a family with a new grief will find theirs met with a little more patience, a little more rigor, because a pathologist once wrote that voluntary requires planning, and the coroner had to read it out loud. And if you are still here at the end of this, then you understand why the family kept going, because silence is a second loss, and because the opposite of silence is the long, imperfect telling we owe to the dead when the official story is too small for the life it tried to contain. They hired their own forensic experts and began to investigate. What they uncovered was chilling. Here is the part most people never hear. The last 90 minutes, rebuilt from fragments the official story treated as background noise. A neighbor on level 11 remembered the elevator doors opening and remaining there, mouth agape, longer than usual, as if someone held the threshold without entering. A courier's handheld scanner docked at the lobby recorded a short outage and instant reconnection that aligned down to the minute, with a lift event no resident swipe could explain. On level 12, the corridor fire door hissed and sealed. A moment later, the same door whispered again, open, shut, as if breath were moving through the building in uneven sighs. None of this proves who was there. All of it says someone was. The family's engineer recreated the chute hatch with factory specifications: spring strength, hinge torque, latch friction, handle throw. With a digital torque wrench and a high-speed camera, he measured the minimum force required to hold the hatch fully open for 3 continuous seconds, the time a person would reasonably need to align their hips and knees, turn a foot inward, and commit the rest of their weight. On average, that force exceeded what a heavily sedated person could sustain with one forearm while balancing on a narrow ledge. You could do it sober, braced, intentional. You could do it with 2 hands and a practiced motion. You could do it if someone else held the door. In the apartment, the interrupted domesticity felt like a second witness. A glass on the kitchen counter carried a pattern of lip oil interrupted by a thumb smear. Someone wiped at the rim and stopped halfway, leaving a crescent of clean within a broader halo. A short message remained unsent on her phone, 6 words, whose last 3 had been retyped with alternate phrasing and then erased, as if she tried to take the heat out of a sentence and couldn't find neutral. The cat's litter tray had been freshly raked with a kitchen spoon, not the plastic scoop that sat untouched beside it. It reads like nothing. It reads like a person marking time until they can do the next thing. You can map every injury to a surface, but you cannot map will. The pathologist said that out loud, and the room went quiet because everyone understood what it meant. A smooth chute interior explains abrasions along the lateral calves if you go in feet first. It does not explain a distinct, small, rounded bruise high on the zygomatic arch that lacks a matching scrape. A terminal impact through a steel bin seam explains pelvic fractures and internal hemorrhage. It does not by itself explain the shallow, clustered bruises that look like fingertips on the superior humerus. Could those have happened earlier, from restraint, from an argument, from something that turned and then turned again? Yes. Could they be artifacts of life lived intensely? Also, yes. Science can tell you where force landed, not why it did. The inquest's neutrality read like indifference to the public, but on the transcript you can hear careful doubt. Sleepwalking was raised. Still knocks can produce automatism, so can emotional exhaustion braided with alcohol. Yet the hatch weight sat there like a stubborn fact. A doctor who had published on parasomnias described a spectrum of complex behaviors: cooking, unlocking doors, even driving, performed without later memory. The engineer, polite to a fault, said that whatever else was true, the mechanics of this hatch, plus the body position observed at the end of the shaft, were unlikely without purposeful alignment or assistance. The coroner said, undetermined. Everyone heard, unsatisfying. People asked why there was no note. People who have never stood in the doorway of a terrible hour always want a note. But lives that end in confusion rarely furnish one. What you get instead are tiny archives: a half-finished email, a calendar reminder to call a friend whose number is memorized anyway, a photograph you cannot place, a receipt for 2 identical items bought minutes apart. Those were there. They did not resolve anything. The building's security firm produced logs and maintenance tickets. One ticket, 3 weeks old, documented a temporary bypass on a service lock to accommodate a contractor working after hours. The bypass had been removed. The sticker recording that action was initialed with a hand that did not match the initials on the work order. The company said that sometimes temp staff filled in. The initials did not necessarily indicate anything. It was the sort of detail that, if you already feared an invisible hand, felt like confirmation. If you did not, it was noise. In the garbage room, the family S investigator crouched where the bin had split and pressed 2 fingertips into a faint mark at the edge of the blood pool that had been cataloged and set aside. He swabbed it anyway, months too late for confidence. The lab report came back with a sentence that would haunt them: insufficient material to generate a profile. It meant nothing and everything at once. You can fill an ocean with insufficient. There is an argument people make in cases like this that sounds tidy and feels cruel, that chaos at the end of a life is best explained by chaos inside a life. It frees you from the obligation to ask whether someone else's choices drove the hour. It also erases the duty to examine systems, building, investigative, medical, that did not rise to the weirdness of the event. The family refused that argument. They kept knocking on doors until the knocking itself was the story. From that persistence came 2 changes that will never fit neatly into a thriller's final act, but matter in the world the rest of us will keep living in. First, the building, and then others like it, quietly increased hatch resistance and added interlock alarms that require a hand to stay present or the door will relatch in seconds. Second, the coroner AS office revised an internal checklist for unusual entries to confined vertical shafts, mandatory secondary scene review, expanded toxicology panels, explicit consultation with mechanical engineers when a mechanism is part of the path to death. They are small memorials made of policy instead of marble, and in their careful bureaucratic way they say, "A life was here." As for the people, they scatter across the story's horizon like landmarks the map doesn't name, friends who still can walk past a chute door without placing a palm flat against it to feel the spring. A concierge who tells new hires that if they hear metal sing in a certain way, they should go look now, not later. A grandfather who keeps a thin folder of clippings and writes 1 neat line at the bottom of each. Do not mistake lack of proof for proof of lack. And then there are the minutes that belong only to the imagination and the architecture. A corridor the color of sleep. Air that moves because a lift car went by. A cat, head up, listening. A phone on a kitchen bench, lighting once, then dark, then lighting again for no one. The hinge, demanding the same steady force from anyone who asks it for passage. The steel, cold. A human being confronted by the narrowest dark you can choose or be pushed toward. If you're waiting here for a revelation, the kind that turns the key and floods the room with certainty, you've mistaken the genre. The revelation is that certainty will not come, and the obligation is to keep the questions sharp anyway. Could Phoebe have opened that hatch herself while medicated and exhausted and not fully present to her own actions? Yes. Could someone have helped by holding the door, by pressuring a decision, by arranging the aftermath to look like misadventure rather than violence? Yes. Could a third set of footsteps have moved unseen through a building that prides itself on being seen? Yes. The tape does not tell you. The logs do not tell you. The physics tell you only that the door is heavy and the path is narrow. So you carry what you can. You carry the facts that resist simplification. You carry the names of mechanisms and medicines and timings. You carry the names of people who loved her in their unglamorous everyday ways. You carry even the changes to hinges and checklists, because the living deserve a world with fewer hidden traps. And you carry most of all the insistence that attention is not exploitation when it is careful. The telling is a form of respect when it refuses to sand the edges off reality. This, then, is where we leave her story. Not closed, not solved, not domesticated into a moral, only witnessed fully. A young woman's life ended in a way that the ordinary tools of narrative cannot pacify. If you feel unsatisfied, that is appropriate. If you feel angry, that is honest. If you feel compelled to say her name out loud, you will not be the first. And if someday a designer hesitates before signing off on a hatch spring because he remembers this case, or a coroner pauses an extra hour in a room that makes no sense, that will be a small kind of justice of the sort the world can actually give. Until then, the questions remain. bright and terrible as any city at night. Who held the door? Who heard the metal sing? Who looked away? And what exactly do we mean when we mark a box, undetermined, and file a life between folders labeled accident and intent?